Yesterday, the Georgia Secretary of State announced he will oversee a hand recount of all ballots that have been cast there.
With the margin being so close, it will require a full by-hand recount in each county. This will help build confidence. It will be an audit, a recount, and a recanvass all at once. It will be a heavy lift, but we will work with the counties to get this done in time for our state certification.
Now, this is highly unlikely to change the result of the state of Georgia, which has Biden winning and leading right now. But regardless of the result, he would still have enough electoral college votes to ascend to the White House. So what ultimately is Trump's endgame here? Team Rising is here to discuss. Joining us, our former senior advisor for the Sanders campaign, president and founder of Solidarity Strategies, and author of T.O. Bernie, Chuck Grocha. And we also have co-host of the Realignment podcast, the one and only Marshall Koslov. Great to see you guys.
Good to see you guys. How are you?
Thanks for having us.
Good.
Of course.
Great.
Hey, Marshall, let me start with you. How do you see this ultimately playing out? What is like the best case scenario and what is sort of like the worst case scenario for Trump ultimately leaving office and handing over power to Joe Biden?
So that's going to happen no matter what. There's no actual debate about how this is going to sort of turn out. Every single one of the court cases hasn't gone Trump's way. If we're actually looking at the charges that are sort of getting alleged, there isn't really any sort of thing that's panned out. So what we're probably going to see happen here is retreat with dignity. So it's important for Trump to sort of put up a fight. It's important for Republican politicians to make it not seem like they stabbed Trump in the back. That's what we're probably going to sort of see happen. The worst case scenario is that this becomes sort of a meme on the right for the next 3 years, that Joe Biden stole the election from President Trump, despite the lack of evidence for that fact. And then we basically, instead of having this 4-year period to actually advance the issues that everyone actually cares about, we spend it just relitigating everything. I think the last thing I'll add is that it's really frustrating that the right rightfully critiqued the Russiagate obsession, yet at the same time is going to do the same exact thing, with frankly way less evidence with Biden's victory going forward.
Chuck, what do you think in general about this dynamic? I know there's a lot of consternation on the left currently. People are like, oh, it's a coup and all of that. It seems much more like flailing about to something to me. You've been involved with elections, recounts, and so much more in your lifetime. What do you make of this scenario?
I think this particular case is all about Georgia. As we all know, y'all have talked about it. We have a runoff there with 2 Senate races. And this particular piece about the hand recount is about the Republicans trying to make sure that as many of those Republicans come back and vote in a runoff. And for all of you novices out there, this is a key thing. Nobody comes back and votes in a runoff like this. It is very, very hard. This is why Democrats always lose runoffs, because it's harder for our people to vote. They're working 2 jobs. They got a couple kids. They got to figure out who's going to watch the kids. So it's just harder for working class Democrats to vote. So what they're doing with this recount is showing that they're fighting. They're going to lose, but then they can turn to their base in Georgia and go, see what they did to us? We have to show up again and show them and do this for Donald Trump. So I think this is very orchestrated. It's a tactic, and I think it's very purposeful what they're trying to pull off.
Marshall, I have an interesting question for you here, which is that you saw the Republican senators say that they want the Georgia Secretary of State fired and a large majority of Georgia Republicans. Could this backfire on the Republican Party in that state? Because what they need to do is actually turn out some of these white suburbanites who voted actually for David Perdue and down-ballot Republicans, but did not vote for Donald Trump.
Yeah, so the more of this is about Trump, the less it's particularly going to be a good thing. But I actually just want to agree with Chuck's point just about the nature of what's going to sort of drive turnout in this sort of fact. I just don't think you can compare what's going to happen in the runoff election to what's happening in November. We sort of saw this broad phenomenon where Republican voters were willing to vote for their down ballot Senate candidates, the House candidates, state legislatures, but they weren't sort of going to go for Trump. There's no reason why that would sort of go. And I just think that Chuck's point that the turnout issue is going to be on the Dem side is just really apt. And so I just want to say one quick thing to your point about just flailing about with sort of the coup. The fear isn't a coup. The issue is that Joe Biden isn't getting his intelligence briefings. That's why Oklahoma Senator James Lankford said he's going to step in tomorrow if that doesn't happen. It does matter if the transition isn't getting actual resources from the General Services Administration. So once again, the fear isn't a coup with the military, but the legitimate fear is just like not normal stuff. And if Republicans need to get a takeaway from last week, it's that voters actually like normal stuff. And this doesn't actually help us case going forward.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, Chuck, I'm curious of your thought, because I feel like after 4 years of covering Trump, the media still hasn't figured out how to do it properly. And I sort of empathize with them because on the one hand, like, we've never had it before where a president loses and he just is like, no, I didn't lose. Like, won't admit it. Is out there, tweeting ridiculous things and alleging fraud in all these ways and like lawsuits everywhere. You can't even keep up with all the things that are flying about. We actually went through yesterday line by line of every single lawsuit and how many ballots they would affect to say, look, even if they're right about everything and they win on all of these cases, which many they've already lost, it wouldn't change the results of the election. But you do have to acknowledge this is like an outrageous situation where you have the president of the United States who's just like, no, I won't admit that I lost. But on the other hand, when you cover that with the level of histrionics that the mainstream media can't resist covering that with, you end up actually feeding into his narrative and handing him more power than he really deserves. I think Sagar is basically right here. He's flailing about. They don't have a leg to stand on. There's nowhere, he's firing all these military people. That's making people super nervous, but there's no way that the military would even back him if he was planning some sort of a military coup, which he's not. But I'm still perplexed of the right way to cover all of these things and make it clear that this is outrageous and unprecedented without handing him the power that he has used to basically beat them up with his entire presidency.
I think the key there in the coverage is realizing, and most people, at least in the Democratic and progressive media, don't want to recognize the fact that half of America voted for Donald Trump, and they voted for him energetically. So you have to give credence there, and you should be talking to that other half instead of just dismissing them. You can do that without empowering the president or his craziness or his thoughts. But we have to be really, really clear as Democrats how we get some of that 70 million back. They really feel the same anxiety that a lot of working class black and brown voters on the Democratic side think. They just weren't bamboozled by this racist rhetoric that they heard nonstop, that they felt like empowered them because they had somebody that could break the system. Because they honestly, between Democrats and these Republicans, feel like the system has broke them and that the system don't work for them. That's why Bernie Sanders was so popular amongst all of this, was because he talks about a rigged system. And in the middle of America, where our press don't want to go and talk to real people, that's a real underlying pressure where people feel like no matter how hard they work and play by the rules, they can't get ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what do you think, Marshall, in terms of how to speak to this responsibly and also with sympathy to the many of the 71 million people who voted for Trump?
Yeah, and look, to shout out my own sort of comments here, I think I just did it, which is that you acknowledged to your point that there is no literal coup, and to Crystal's point too, there is no fear that the military is walking throughout the streets of D.C. to sort of remove Biden from the stage on Inauguration Day. But at the same time, there are serious, real consequences. Like I said before, the General Services Administration, it actually does matter that you don't have the resources to transition properly. It actually is not okay that this is sort of happening. Like, despite all the attacks that Democrats made with Russiagate, President Obama still gave the resources to help President Trump transition. Hillary Clinton still did concede the morning after she lost the presidential election. So there are real consequences. So what you have to do is you have to bracket the crazy stuff away that gets you clicks and get you Patreon subscribers, but also focus on the real thing that really matters here, which is that, hey, like, it actually is really important that President-elect Biden get intelligence briefings just the same way that President Trump got them as well too after Obama lost. Hillary lost.
To me, the scariest part is, the GSA thing. Yeah, that's not great that he set back and we need that transition to go smoothly. To me, the scariest part is what you laid out, Marshall, which is that you're going to have tens of millions of Americans who never believe that Joe Biden rightfully won this election. And that's a problem for the country. I mean, just in the same way that it was a problem for the country that you had tens of millions of Americans believing that, Trump was some Putin puppet, Manchurian candidate and never really accepted his legitimacy in that way. I wonder if it's now the new normal that basically you're going to have a large portion of the country that just doesn't believe that whoever gets elected president, if it isn't their man or woman, is rightfully and justifiably in that role.
Yeah, that's almost certainly true. And that's sort of the issue with everything getting so polarized and having these sort of different narratives and different sort of media, which is that you could have any narrative you sort of want. You know, in 2024, you'll probably have something like that happen from sort of either direction. So the thing is just so key, and this is why Trump is sort of the figure of our sort of age, which is that at the end of the day, Hillary Clinton, even if she'd wanted to, couldn't have gotten rid of Russiagate because there were just sort of these bigger sort of forces, everything from the mainstream media to individual actors. But Trump is just so powerful in the Republican Party that if President Trump were to just be mature and concede the way that he's supposed to concede, he could have done it, right? There's a bunch of narratives that he could advance that still would make President Biden legitimate, that would also still give him a bit of dignity. So we could talk about, oh, Jack Dorsey did this thing before I lost, or the mainstream media did this thing before I lost, and that's why I'm going to run back and take this back in 2024. He has the choice that he can make here that can make a difference, and he's just not making that choice.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Well said. All right, guys, stick with us. More Rising after this.